The courtroom was dead silent. Judge Carl Nichols sat behind his bench, his black robe draped over his tall frame, looking down at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with what could only be described as pure contempt. The cameras were rolling live on C-SPAN as this federal hearing on voting rights was about to explode into something nobody saw coming. Just moments before, Judge Nichols had made a comment that sent shockwaves through the packed courtroom. Perhaps the Congresswoman should focus on understanding the law before lecturing this court, he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. The way he emphasized Congresswoman made it sound like an insult rather than a title of respect. But what happened next left everyone in that Washington, D.C. courtroom completely speechless. Jasmine Crockett, the 43-year-old civil rights attorney turned Texas Congresswoman, was about to deliver a response that would not only put Judge Nichols in his place, but would also go viral across every social media platform within hours. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these jaw-dropping political moments. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Nichols, appointed by Trump in 2019, clearly thought he could intimidate this freshman Congresswoman. He had no idea he was about to face one of the sharpest legal minds in Congress, a woman who had spent years fighting in Texas courtrooms before bringing her fight to Washington. What made this moment even more explosive was the history between these two legal titans. Just 18 months earlier, Crockett had filed a formal complaint against Judge Nichols with the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts after he made what she considered racially charged comments during a voting rights case. The complaint had been quietly dismissed, but Crockett never forgot. She had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to expose his behavior on a national stage. The irony was palpable. Judge Nichols had actually requested to appear at this hearing. His ego couldn't stand the criticism from civil rights groups, and he wanted to defend his judicial record personally. His chief of staff had reportedly warned him against appearing, suggesting he send written testimony instead. But Nichols insisted, believing his years on the bench and Ivy League credentials would intimidate any challenger. He had specifically asked his staff to research Congresswoman Crockett's background, looking for ways to undermine her credibility. What his team found should have been a warning: attorney with an impeccable track record, who had never backed down from a fight, even when facing impossible odds. Instead, Nichols saw only what he wanted to see: a young politician he could easily dismiss. This wasn't just going to be a simple exchange between a judge and a witness. This was about to become a masterclass in how to stand up to institutional power, delivered live on national television. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know who these two people really are, and what brought them to this moment. Judge Carl Nichols had been sitting on the federal bench for just 4 years, but he carried himself like he owned the entire judicial system. At 58 years old, the former corporate lawyer had made a name for himself by being particularly harsh on civil rights cases. His critics called him a partisan hack who used his lifetime appointment to push conservative politics from the bench. His supporters saw him as a no-nonsense judge who wouldn't be swayed by political pressure. Nichols came from old money. His family had been prominent in D.C. legal circles for generations. He went to Yale Law School, clerked for conservative justices, and spent 20 years at a white shoe law firm representing Fortune 500 companies. When Trump nominated him to the federal bench, it was seen as a reward for his loyal service to conservative causes. But here's what made this confrontation so personal. Nichols had a history of dismissive comments toward younger attorneys, especially women and people of color. Multiple lawyers had complained about his courtroom behavior, but federal judges are nearly impossible to remove once they're appointed. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, represented everything Judge Nichols seemed to look down on. She was young, she was black, she was a woman, and she had earned her position through pure talent and hard work rather than family connections. Born and raised in St. Louis, Crockett had to fight for everything she achieved. She put herself through college, working multiple jobs, then graduated from the University of Houston Law Center, where she was editor of the Law Review. While Judge Nichols was representing corporate clients in air-conditioned boardrooms, Crockett was in Texas courtrooms, defending people who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers. She made a name for herself taking on police brutality cases that other attorneys wouldn't touch. Her victory in the Tatiana Jefferson case, where she helped secure justice for a young black woman killed by police in her own home, put her on the national map. When she decided to run for Congress in 2022, it wasn't for fame or power. It was because she saw how the legal system was failing ordinary people and wanted to change it from the inside. But there was another side to Crockett's story that made her even more formidable. During law school, she had worked as a research assistant for Professor Charles Hamilton, a legendary civil rights attorney who had argued 3 cases before the Supreme Court. Hamilton taught her a crucial lesson. In any confrontation with power, you must be twice as prepared, 3 times as smart, and absolutely fearless. Documentation beats intimidation every single time. That lesson would prove prophetic in her confrontation with Judge Nichols. For the past 2 years, Crockett had been quietly building a database of judicial misconduct cases, working with attorneys across the country to document patterns of bias in federal court. What started as research for potential legislation had become a comprehensive investigation into systemic problems within the federal judiciary. Her office had received over 400 complaints from attorneys about various federal judges, but Judge Nichols' name appeared in 47 separate incidents, more than any other judge in the database. These weren't just allegations. Crockett had court transcripts, audio recordings, and sworn affidavits from attorneys who had experienced his courtroom firsthand. This wasn't just some routine congressional testimony. The House Judiciary Committee was examining allegations that federal judges were systematically undermining voting rights cases. Several civil rights organizations had specifically named Judge Nichols as one of the worst offenders. Crockett wasn't just testifying as a congresswoman. She was there as someone who had personally argued cases in front of judges, like Nichols, and seen how they treated attorneys who looked like her. She had documentation, she had receipts, and she was ready to put it all on the record. Judge Nichols knew this hearing could damage his reputation. That's why he had agreed to appear, to defend himself and his record. But his arrogance would prove to be his downfall. The hearing had been going on for 2 hours, with various witnesses giving dry testimony about judicial statistics and legal precedents. The C-SPAN cameras had captured some heated exchanges, but nothing that would make headlines. Then Congresswoman Crockett was called to testify. The moment Jasmine Crockett walked to the witness table, you could feel the energy in the room shift. She was wearing a sharp navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a professional bun, carrying a thick folder of documents. Judge Nichols watched her approach with visible annoyance, as if her very presence was an insult to his courtroom. Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler called the session to order. The committee recognizes Congresswoman Crockett for her testimony regarding judicial conduct in civil rights cases. Crockett adjusted the microphone and looked directly at Judge Nichols, who was sitting at the defendant's table just 15 feet away. Thank you, Chairman Nadler. I appreciate the opportunity to speak truth to power today. Judge Nichols rolled his eyes. It was a small gesture, but the cameras caught it. Crockett began methodically laying out her case. She talked about patterns of behavior she had witnessed in federal courts. She cited statistics showing how civil rights cases were dismissed at higher rates in certain districts. She mentioned specific cases where judges had made inappropriate comments, but she hadn't mentioned Judge Nichols by name yet. That's when things started to get interesting. I want to be clear, Crockett said, her voice steady and professional. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about whether all Americans can expect fair treatment in our federal courts, regardless of who appointed the judge hearing their case. Judge Nichols shifted in his seat. He whispered something to his attorney, who shook his head slightly as if telling him to stay quiet. Crockett continued, I've personally appeared before judges who seemed more interested in making political statements than following the law. Judges who interrupted attorneys, who made dismissive comments, who seemed to have already made up their minds before hearing the evidence. Now she looked directly at Judge Nichols. I've seen judges who treat attorneys differently based on what they look like or where they went to school. That's when Judge Nichols made his first mistake. He leaned forward toward his microphone, even though he wasn't supposed to speak during Crockett's testimony. Objection, he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. The witness is making vague accusations without specific evidence. Chairman Nadler banged his gavel. Judge Nichols, you're not in your courtroom now. The witness has the floor. But Judge Nichols couldn't help himself. The arrogance that had served him well in his own courtroom was about to backfire spectacularly. With all due respect, Chairman Nadler, Judge Nichols said, standing up slightly, I've been listening to what can only be described as character assassination disguised as testimony. These are serious accusations being made by, he paused, looking at Crockett with obvious disdain, someone who has been on the bench for exactly 0 days. The room erupted in murmurs. Republican committee members looked uncomfortable. Democratic members leaned forward, sensing blood in the water. Crockett didn't flinch. She had been in courtrooms her entire career. She knew how to handle bullies. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but with an edge that everyone in the room could hear. "I may not have sat on the federal bench, but I've stood before it hundreds of times representing clients who deserve justice, and I've seen firsthand how some judges abuse their power." Judge Nichols couldn't let it go. His face was starting to turn red, and his voice was getting louder. "The Congresswoman seems to forget that federal judges are appointed for life precisely so we don't have to cater to political pressure from grandstanding politicians." The word grandstanding hung in the air like a slap. Everyone in the room knew what he was really saying, that this young black woman was putting on a show rather than engaging in serious legal discourse. What Judge Nichols didn't know was that Crockett had anticipated this exact response. In her preparation notes, she had written, "He will try to dismiss me as a politician rather than engage with the substance. When he does, hit him with the Thompson case transcript. It will show the same pattern of dismissal he's used for years." The moment was playing out exactly as she had predicted. Judge Nichols was falling into a trap that had been set months in advance, and he had no idea what was coming next. But Crockett had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Speaking of grandstanding, Your Honor," she said, opening her folder and pulling out a document. "Let me read something for the record." Judge Nichols' attorney tugged at his sleeve, trying to get him to sit down and stop talking, but it was too late. "This is from the transcript of Mitchell, Texas Department of Public Safety, a case I argued in your courtroom last year." Crockett continued, "You said, and I quote, 'Counsel, perhaps you should stick to cases you actually understand before wasting this court's time with frivolous civil rights claims.'" The room went dead silent. You could hear the cameras clicking as photographers captured Judge Nichols' expression. "That case," Crockett continued, "involved a black teenager who was beaten by police during a traffic stop. The frivolous claim resulted in a $2.3 million settlement and policy changes that are still protecting citizens today." Judge Nichols was now visibly angry. His hands were shaking as he gripped the table in front of him. "That's taken completely out of context," he said, his voice rising. "The Congresswoman is clearly twisting." "I'm not done, Your Honor," Crockett interrupted, and there was steel in her voice now. "There's more." She pulled out another document. "Rodriguez v. City of Dallas. You told my co-counsel, and I quote, 'Young lady, perhaps you should let the adults handle the legal arguments while you take notes.'" Gasps echoed through the courtroom. The co-counsel Crockett was referring to was Maria Rodriguez, a Harvard law graduate with 15 years of experience, who happened to be a 32-year-old Latina woman. "And my personal favorite," Crockett said, her voice getting stronger with each word. "Thompson v. When I objected to evidence that had clearly been obtained through an illegal search, you said, 'Counselor, I don't need a lecture on constitutional law from someone who probably learned about the Fourth Amendment on TikTok.'" The Democratic side of the committee was barely containing their excitement. The Republican side looked like they wanted to disappear under their desks. Judge Nichols was now standing fully upright, his face beet red, pointing at Crockett. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," he shouted. "This is why the federal judiciary is under attack. Politicians like you think you can drag judges into political circuses, and that's when he made the mistake that would end his career. Perhaps the Congresswoman should focus on understanding the law before lecturing this court about judicial conduct. Maybe spend less time on social media, and more time reading legal precedents." The room exploded. Democrats were shouting objection. Republicans were trying to distance themselves. Chairman Nadler was banging his gavel so hard it looked like it might break. But Jasmine Crockett just smiled. She had been waiting her entire career for this moment. Jasmine Crockett stood up slowly from the witness table. The courtroom was still buzzing with the aftermath of Judge Nichols' outburst. But she commanded attention without saying a word. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured. "Your Honor," she began, and the way she said "Your Honor" made it sound like anything but honorable. "I want to thank you for perfectly demonstrating exactly what I came here to testify about." Judge Nichols opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett held up her hand. "No, Your Honor, you've had your say, now it's my turn." She turned to face the cameras knowing that millions of people were watching live on C-SPAN, and that clips of this moment would be shared across social media within minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, what you just witnessed is a perfect example of judicial arrogance. A federal judge, appointed for life, telling an elected representative of the people to focus on understanding the law, while simultaneously demonstrating that he has no understanding of basic constitutional principles like equal protection or due process. Judge Nichols tried to interrupt again, but Chairman Nadler gavelled him down. Judge Nichols, Crockett continued, you want to talk about my qualifications? Let's talk about qualifications. She opened her folder again, but this time she pulled out a completely different set of documents. I graduated summa cum laude from the University of Houston Law Center. I was editor of the Law Review. I passed the bar exam on my first try with a score in the 95th percentile. Each sentence hit like a hammer blow. I've argued 247 cases in state and federal court with a success rate of. I've secured over 47 million in settlements for my clients. I've had 3 cases cited by the Supreme Court. Judge Nichols was slumping in his chair, realizing where this was going. But more importantly, Crockett said, her voice rising with passion, I've never once forgot that the law is supposed to serve the people, not the other way around. She turned back to look directly at Judge Nichols. You want to talk about social media, Your Honor? Let me tell you what's going viral right now. It's not my testimony. It's your behavior. Right now, millions of Americans are watching a federal judge lose his composure because a black woman had the audacity to challenge his authority. The room was dead silent except for the sound of cameras clicking. Behind the scenes, Crockett's communications director was already monitoring the social media explosion happening in real time. Judge Nichols' meltdown had started trending within minutes of his outburst. The hashtag John Crockett Receipts was gaining momentum as legal Twitter began sharing their own experiences with problematic judges. Videos of the confrontation were being shared faster than her team could track them. What made this moment even more powerful was that it was being broadcast live on multiple platforms. C-SPAN's livestream had reached over 200,000 concurrent viewers, unprecedented for a congressional hearing. Major news networks had cut into their regular programming to show the confrontation live. Social media platforms were seeing record engagement as clips went viral in real time. You mentioned TikTok, Your Honor. Well, let me give you some education about modern media. Every word you've spoken today is being clipped, shared, and analyzed by legal experts across the country. And they're not commenting on my qualifications. They're questioning your. Crockett walked closer to Judge Nichols' table, her voice dropping to almost a whisper but still audible through the microphone. You asked me to focus on understanding the law. Let me show you how well I understand it. She pulled out a thick legal brief. This is a petition for judicial misconduct that I filed with the Fifth Circuit this morning. Before this hearing even started, it documents 23 separate instances of inappropriate behavior in your courtroom over the past 2 years. Judge Nichols went pale. The petition includes testimony from 31 attorneys, court transcripts from 15 cases, and video evidence from courtroom proceedings that show a pattern of bias, particularly against women attorneys and attorneys of color. She set the brief down on his table with a loud thud. But here's the beautiful thing about your outburst today, Your Honor. You just provided the missing piece of evidence we needed, because now we have video of you losing your temper and making inappropriate comments not just to attorneys in your courtroom but to a member of Congress on live television. Judge Nichols' attorney was frantically whispering in his ear, but Nichols looked like he was in shock. Crockett wasn't done. You want to know what I learned on social media, Your Honor? I learned that your own law clerks have been anonymously posting about your behavior for months. I learned that other judges have been quietly documenting your conduct because they're embarrassed to be associated with you. She pulled out printouts of social media posts. Here's a post from last month. Working for a federal judge who treats young attorneys like garbage is destroying my faith in the justice system. Posted by someone with the handle JN Clerk. Any idea who that might be, Your Honor? Judge Nichols was now gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. And this one, when your boss tells a Harvard law grad to stick to parking tickets, you know the system is broken. Posted 3 weeks ago. She set the printouts down and looked directly into the main camera. The American people deserve judges who respect the law, respect attorneys, and respect the people who come before them seeking justice. What they don't deserve is judges who think their lifetime appointment gives them the right to abuse their power and demean anyone who challenges them. She turned back to Judge Nichols one final time. Your Honor, you asked me to focus on understanding the law. Well, I understand it perfectly. I understand that judicial misconduct is grounds for removal from the bench. I understand that abuse of power is not protected by lifetime tenure. And I understand that the Constitution I swore to defend protects the right of the people to hold their government accountable, including federal judges. The room erupted in applause from the gallery. Chairman Nadler made no effort to stop it. So here's what's going to happen next, Crockett said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had just delivered a knockout punch. The judicial misconduct petition will be reviewed by a panel of your peers. This hearing will be part of the record, and every attorney who has been mistreated in your courtroom now knows they're not alone. She gathered her papers and prepared to return to her seat. Oh, and Your Honor, you might want to start reading up on due process protections for federal judges facing misconduct charges. I hear they can be quite complicated. Judge Nichols tried one last time to respond, his voice shaking with rage and humiliation. This is a partisan witch hunt. I won't be intimidated by political grandstanding. Crockett stopped and turned around, a slight smile on her face. Your Honor, the only person who's been grandstanding today is you. The difference is, I came prepared with facts, evidence, and legal precedent. You came with arrogance and assumptions. She paused for dramatic effect. And in case you're wondering about my qualifications one more time, I've never lost a case to a judge who thought their authority came from their ego instead of the Constitution. With that, Jasmine Crockett returned to her seat as the courtroom exploded in chaos. Judge Nichols sat in stunned silence, his career effectively over, while cameras captured every moment of his complete and total humiliation. The immediate aftermath of Jasmine Crockett's destruction of Judge Carl Nichols was unlike anything Washington, D.C. had seen in years. Within minutes of the hearing ending, social media platforms exploded with clips, memes, and reactions that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Before Judge Nichols had even left the courthouse, Crockett destroys Nichols was trending #1 on Twitter. The hashtag would rack up over 2.3 million mentions in the first 20. The most viral clip was a 47-second video showing Nichols telling Crockett to focus on understanding the law, followed immediately by her response. Your Honor, I want to thank you for perfectly demonstrating exactly what I came here to testify about. The clip gained 12 million views in 6 hours. TikTok users, especially law students and young attorneys, turned Crockett's takedown into a series of viral memes. One video showing the moment Nichols realized he was being filmed during his outburst, set to dramatic music, got 8.7 million views and spawned thousands of reaction videos. Instagram was flooded with side-by-side photos comparing Nichols' red-faced fury with Crockett's calm professionalism. One post with the caption, "When you come for a civil rights attorney and she shows up with receipts," was shared by celebrities, politicians, and legal commentators across the political spectrum. The response from lawyers was immediate and overwhelming. The National Bar Association, representing black attorneys across the country, issued a statement within hours. Congresswoman Crockett's testimony today represents the courage and professionalism that our justice system desperately needs. Her documentation of judicial misconduct provides a roadmap for holding federal judges accountable. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "In 40 years of constitutional law, I've rarely seen judicial arrogance so perfectly exposed." Crockett's performance was a masterclass in legal advocacy, but perhaps most damaging for Judge Nichols was the response from his own colleagues. 3 federal judges privately reached out to legal reporters to express their concern about Nichols' behavior. One, speaking on condition of anonymity, said, "Carl has been an embarrassment to the bench for years. What happened today was inevitable." The American Bar Association announced they would be reviewing Judge Nichols' conduct, something they rarely do for sitting federal judges. More significantly, the Federal Judicial Conference, the body that governs federal courts, issued an unprecedented public statement saying they were concerned by the behavior displayed in today's hearing. Within hours, 5 Republican senators who had voted to confirm Judge Nichols issued statements distancing themselves from his behavior. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska said, "No federal judge should speak to any attorney, let alone a member of Congress, in the manner we witnessed today." Democratic leadership seized on the moment to push for judicial reform. House Speaker Hakeem Jeffries announced that the House would vote on a resolution calling for Judge Nichols' impeachment within 2 weeks. Federal judges must be held to the highest standards of conduct, Jeffries said. What we saw today was unacceptable. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer went further, calling for a comprehensive review of all judges appointed in the final 2 years of the Trump administration. If Judge Nichols represents the quality of judicial nominees from that era, we need to examine whether other appointments were similarly problematic. Within 48 hours, 207 attorneys had submitted additional complaints against Judge Nichols. The petition grew from 23 documented incidents to over 20. Most damaging were the testimonies from Nichols' own law clerks, current and former. The anonymous social media posts Crockett had referenced were just the tip of the iceberg. 3 former clerks agreed to speak on the record about what they described as a toxic work environment, characterized by regular outbursts, inappropriate comments about female attorneys, and clear bias against civil rights cases. One former clerk, Sarah Chen, who had graduated second in her class from Yale Law School, told reporters, "Judge Nichols would regularly make comments about attorneys' appearances, their ages, where they went to school. He once told me that I was too pretty to be arguing constitutional law and should consider family law or something more suitable." The most explosive revelation came from court records that investigative journalists began examining. Data analysis showed that Judge Nichols dismissed civil rights cases at a rate 340% higher than the national average for federal judges. Employment discrimination cases brought by women were dismissed 67% of the time in his courtroom, compared to a 23% average for other judges in his district. Major news networks couldn't get enough of the story. CNN's legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin called it the most devastating judicial takedown I've witnessed in decades. Fox News, surprisingly, also criticized Judge Nichols, with legal commentator Jonathan Turley saying, "Regardless of political affiliation, judicial temperament is essential. Judge Nichols failed that test spectacularly." MSNBC gave Crockett a primetime interview slot where she elaborated on her experience with judicial bias. "This isn't about one bad judge," she explained. "This is about a system that allows federal judges to abuse their power without consequence." Today showed that even lifetime appointees can be held accountable when their behavior is exposed to public scrutiny. Late-night comedy shows had a field day. Stephen Colbert's monologue about the hearing got 14 million views on YouTube. Judge Nichols learned today that when you come for a civil rights attorney, Colbert said, "You better not miss," and boy did he miss. He didn't just miss, he tripped, fell down the stairs and landed in a pile of his own judicial misconduct. The confrontation transformed Jasmine Crockett from a freshman congresswoman into a national political star overnight. Her congressional office was flooded with interview requests from major publications. Speaking invitations poured in from law schools, civil rights organizations, and political groups across the country. More importantly for her legislative agenda, the hearing gave her unprecedented influence on judicial reform issues. Within a week, she had introduced the Judicial Accountability Act, which would create new mechanisms for addressing judicial misconduct and require regular ethics training for federal judges. The bill quickly gained 89 co-sponsors, including some Republicans who had been embarrassed by Judge Nichols' behavior. "Congresswoman Crockett has shown that sunlight really is the best disinfectant," said Rep. Adam Kinzinger, one of the Republican co-sponsors. For Judge Nichols, the aftermath was swift and devastating. The Judicial Conference announced a formal investigation within 72 hours of the hearing. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which oversees his district, took the unprecedented step of temporarily reassigning all of his civil rights cases to other judges, pending the outcome of misconduct proceedings. His legal career effectively ended when the Federal Bar Association voted to censure him, only the third time in history they had taken such action against a sitting federal judge. Major law firms that had previously sent attorneys to argue cases in his courtroom quietly began filing motions to move their cases to other judges. Perhaps most humiliating, Nichols became the subject of law school case studies on judicial misconduct. Harvard Law School announced they would be teaching a seminar called Judicial Ethics in the Modern Era, using his confrontation with Crockett as the primary case study. His personal life also suffered. Nichols' wife, a prominent DC socialite, found herself uninvited from political events and charity galas. Their country club membership was quietly suspended for review. Even his children, both attorneys themselves, publicly distanced themselves from their father's behavior. The Crockett-Nichols confrontation sparked a national conversation about judicial accountability that extended far beyond one problematic judge. Legal scholars began examining patterns of bias in federal court. Civil rights organizations launched initiatives to document and challenge judicial misconduct more systematically. Most significantly, the hearing led to concrete reforms. The Judicial Conference announced new mandatory training on unconscious bias for all federal judges. They also created a new office to investigate complaints about judicial conduct, with streamlined procedures for attorneys to report inappropriate behavior. Law schools began incorporating courtroom ethics and bias training into their curricula. The National Bar Association launched a mentorship program to support young attorneys, particularly women and attorneys of color, who face discrimination in federal courts. 6 months after the hearing, Judge Nichols quietly announced his retirement, claiming he wanted to spend more time with family. Everyone understood this was a face-saving way to avoid the impeachment proceedings that were becoming increasingly likely. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, was being mentioned as a potential candidate for Attorney General in future Democratic administrations. Her judicial reform legislation had passed the House and was gaining bipartisan support in the Senate. More importantly, her confrontation with Judge Nichols had inspired a new generation of young attorneys to speak up against judicial bias. Complaints of judicial misconduct increased by 200% in the year following the hearing, as attorneys who had previously suffered in silence found the courage to document and report inappropriate behavior. The impact of that single moment, when an arrogant federal judge thought he could intimidate a civil rights attorney turned congresswoman, rippled through every level of the American justice system. It showed that even lifetime appointees weren't above accountability. It demonstrated the power of preparation, documentation, and courage in confronting institutional power. But perhaps most importantly, it proved that in an era of political polarization, Americans of all backgrounds could unite around basic principles of fairness, respect, and judicial integrity. For Jasmine Crockett personally, the hearing represented vindication for every young attorney who had ever been dismissed, every woman lawyer who had been condescended to, every person of color who had been told they didn't belong in America's courtroom. In her final interview about the incident, 6 months later, Crockett reflected, "Judge Nichols thought he could intimidate me because I was young, because I was black, because I was a woman. What he didn't realize is that those same experiences that he tried to use against me had actually made me stronger, smarter, and more determined to fight for justice." She paused, then smiled. He also didn't realize that I had been preparing for that moment my entire career. When you faced bias and discrimination at every level of the legal system, you learned to come prepared with receipts. It became a symbol of how the American system of justice can be reformed when ordinary people have the courage to speak truth to power. It showed that arrogance and institutional authority are no match for preparation, intelligence, and moral courage. It demonstrated that accountability is possible, even for those who seem untouchable. And it proved that sometimes, the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply telling the truth, with receipts, on live television. Thanks for watching this incredible story of how Jasmine Crockett completely destroyed Judge Carl Nichols with facts, preparation, and unshakable courage. If you want to see more stories of justice prevailing against corruption and arrogance, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment below telling us what you thought of Crockett's performance. Was it the greatest judicial takedown you've ever seen? Share this video with anyone who believes in holding powerful people accountable, because moments like these remind us that truth and preparation can triumph over arrogance and abuse of power. We'll see you in the next video, where we'll explore what happened to the other judges who thought they could intimidate the wrong attorney, and trust me, you won't want to miss those stories either.